name is Andrew Sheets, and this is my presentation on how video game physics have developed over the years and how it has impacted the gaming industry. This is the thesis repeated. The beginnings of physics in the video games. The implementation of physics in games has always been and continues to be a rapidly developing and important aspect of the video game industry, regarding everything from game design to player immersion to just general physics in the games. Things as simple as walking to something as complicated as shooting a bullet all fall under the umbrella of physics, and nearly every way physics are either directly or indirectly involved with gameplay. This is in part because so many games involve some aspect or another of the physical world we live in, which, of course, rely upon physics as the laws that govern how things work. So the first notable video game to use physics was in fact one of the first games ever made, Pong, released in 1972. The players controlled it with a paddle and attempted to bounce a small white ball to one side of the screen past their opponent to score points. While it never ran anything near as complicated as a physics engine, it did attempt to make physics even if it was just an illusion of physics as part of its gameplay. So it was one of the first games ever to use physics in some way. So the beginnings of physics continued. The technology at the time was too rudimentary for fully fledged physics engines, and as a result, few games ever focused on physics-based gameplay either. In the 1980s, there were few games where physics played over any real role. Most games at the time used canned animations, where physical interactions would be pre-drawn into pixel art and played at the appropriate time. A canned animation would play at the same time same way every time. Regardless of how the player interacted with the game. In the 1990s, actual 3D real-time game physics actually became a thing. So physics engines were developed to allow things like weight, gravity, and direction of contact to be factored in objects. Among these innovations was the creation of the in-game Enry Ragdoll, which would be made up of virtual bones and hinges that would dictate how a body would move and bend in real time. Jurassic Park Trespasser, as you can see in the background, released in 1998, and it was the first game to take full advantage of a physics engine, and is widely considered to be a pioneer in the world of modern video game physics simulations. And while the game itself was not financially or critically successful, it did set off a chain reaction which would pave the way for many modern games. The early 2000s and the critical success of games with physics. So, 3D games of this era began using entirely physics-based environments with traditionally non-interactable objects, now being movable, letting players reshape the game world extensively and allowing for entirely unique experiences. Games like Half-Life and Elder Scrolls Morrowind successfully utilize physics-based interactions on a large scale, and in terms of things like puzzles and environmental immersion. Additionally, unlike Jurassic Park Trespasser, these titles went on to be some of the most notable of their era and have been successful enough to make sequels, some even being still going today. After these benchmark successes in the industry, it was safe to say real-time physics were now being seen as a staple for the FPS genre. The mid-2000s and the ubiquity of game physics. As the 2000s continued, physics engines became more accessible and standardized, allowing for game developers to forgo physics engines themselves. Forgo making physics engines themselves, This development in the industry allowed more games to use physics without inflating production costs. Entire games are now being made with physics as their central gameplay mechanic, and as a result of their widespread implementation, they were now being seen as an essential part of several different game genres. The mid-2000s continued. By the late 2000s, physics engines had become an integral part of the creation process for virtually every major game developer. This was especially true for first-person shooters, where physics engines were crucial to the player's ability to interact with the world around them in the form of real-time world physics rather than traditional ray tracing, which had been used a lot in the past. By the end of the 2000s, physics engines were being used so extensively within various genres of video games, they had become almost synonymous with the medium itself. So, the accuracy of in-game physics and its consequences. So, the purpose of implementing physics in games was, of course, to make the game world feel more believable and fun to experiment in. And as a result of this, it often made more sense to tweak variables to make physics less realistic, but more complementary of the gameplay experience. Physics engines were not always used in ways that made sense physically, but often this wasn't of much consequence due to the fact that they accomplished their purpose of allowing players new ways of interacting and exploring 3D environments. More accurate physics simulations, paradoxically, were not always as believable as the more exaggerated physics used in games. As well, they were typically less performant on hardware, so they were rarely ever used. So, whether intentional or otherwise, physics in games had never been very accurate to how objects react in the real world, and I doubt that they ever really will. However, most people will hardly ever notice the difference. So, in conclusion, although other aspects of game design have changed significantly over time, the need to accurately simulate the physical properties of objects in a 3D space has remained constant. Players today expect their virtual worlds to obey the same rules as the real world, and as a result, modern video games are largely built around physics. As the video game industry continues on, it's likely that physics will only get more interesting and believable over time. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Hope you have a nice day.